November 2nd, 1983. The air inside the bunker was recycled, stale, and smelled faintly of ozone and cheap tobacco. We are deep beneath the streets of Moscow, inside the nerve center of the KGB, a place where the sun never shines and the clocks do not matter. Only the data matters. For the men in this room, the world is not made of trees or rivers or cities. It is made of signals. It is made of intercepted radio waves, burst transmissions, and the rhythmic pulse of radar sweeps. They are the eyes and ears of the Soviet Union, tasked with the most terrifying job in human history, watching for the end of the world. Usually, the flow of information is a river. It has a current. It has a predictable speed. NATO exercises happen every autumn. The Americans fly their bombers, the British sail their destroyers, and the West Germans move their tanks. It is a dance. The Soviet analysts know the steps. They watch the choreography, they log the frequencies, and they file the reports. It is routine. It is safe. But tonight the river has stopped, and in its place, something else is rising. At 0800 hours, a teletype machine begins to chatter in the corner of the room. It is not a standard report. It is a priority flash from a listening post in Eastern Europe. The operator tears the paper free, his eyes scanning the Cyrillic text. He freezes. He reads it again, his breath catching in his throat. He stands up, his chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor, a sound that echoes like a gunshot in the quiet room. The message describes an anomaly. NATO communications traffic has spiked. That in itself is not unusual for a drill. But the texture of the traffic is wrong. The encryption protocols have changed. The standard exercise headers, the digital flags that say, "This is a game," are missing from key channels. Instead of the relaxed chatter of soldiers playing war, the listeners are hearing the clipped, terrifyingly precise language of men preparing for the real thing. Then comes the second anomaly. A report comes in from a field agent in Brussels. It is frantic. It claims that key personnel at NATO headquarters are not following the drill schedule. Officers who should be in the canteen are in the secure war rooms. Lights that should be off are burning through the night. And then, the third anomaly. The one that turns the blood of the senior analyst to ice. A burst transmission from the United Kingdom indicates that the Prime Minister and the Queen constitute part of the communications loop. This is impossible. In a drill, you use actors. You use junior officers pretending to be heads of state. You do not involve the actual leadership of the Western world. You do not move the Queen of England into a command loop unless the missiles are already in the air or are about to be. The senior analyst stares at the map on the wall. The red markers representing Soviet divisions seem suddenly fragile. The blue markers of NATO seem predatory. The room descends into a chaotic, hushed frenzy. Phones are lifted. Secure lines to the Politburo are activated. Men in ill-fitting uniforms are sweating under the fluorescent lights, their hands shaking as they light fresh cigarettes from the embers of the old ones. They are asking the question that has haunted their nightmares for 30 years. Is this it? Is this the moment the Americans finally stop posturing and start shooting? The confusion is absolute. There is no clear picture, just fragments of a nightmare assembling itself in real time. A sudden radio silence from a US Air Force base in West Germany. A strange movement of B-52 bombers in the Pacific. It does not look like a drill. It looks like a mobilization. It looks like the opening moves of a coordinated, global decapitation strike designed to wipe the Soviet Union off the map before a single Russian order can be given. The incident is not a single explosion or a crashing plane. It is a pattern that defies all logic of peace. To the men in that bunker, looking at the glowing screens, it looks like the Americans have gone insane. It looks like they've decided to win the Cold War today, by burning the world to ash. If you want to understand the hidden mechanisms of the past and the terrifying moments where history almost ended, make sure you subscribe to the Cold War Impact channel. We dig into the classified files to bring you the stories they didn't want you to know. The fear in the room is not just professional, it is primal. To understand why these men are trembling, you have to understand the stakes. You have to understand the year 1983. This is not the détente of the 1970s. That era is dead. This is the era of Ronald Reagan. To the West, he is a strong leader. To the men in this bunker, he is a cowboy with a finger on the trigger. He has called their country an evil empire. He has deployed new weapons that have terrified the Kremlin. But the terror goes deeper than rhetoric. For 2 years, the KGB has been running the largest, most sensitive intelligence operation in its history. It is codenamed Ryan. Raketno-ядерное нападение, Operation Nuclear Missile Attack. The premise of Ryan is simple and horrifying. The Soviet leadership is convinced, absolutely convinced, that the United States is planning a surprise first strike. They believe the Americans know the Soviet economy is failing, that the technology gap is widening, and that the West sees a window of opportunity to destroy communism once and for all. The orders given to the KGB agents worldwide were clear: watch for the signs, watch for blood drives, watch for the price of gold, watch for the movement of key generals, watch for the lights burning late at the Pentagon. And now, on this cold November night, every single sign is turning red. The impossible event is that the Americans are breaking the rules of the game. They are using new codes. They are moving real leaders. They are shifting to a war footing under the guise of a drill called Able Archer. But the Soviets cannot see the binder that says drill. They can only see the gun being pointed at their head. The stakes are total annihilation. If the analysts in this room are right, and this is a real attack, they have minutes to respond. If they wait for confirmation, the Pershing II missiles will already be impacting Moscow. The flight time of a Pershing II from West Germany to the Kremlin is less than 10 minutes. 10 minutes? That is not enough time to think. That is not enough time to verify. That is only enough time to panic, or to fire back. In the bunker, the commander grabs the red phone. His voice is tight. He is not calling for a drill. He is calling the general staff. He is telling them that the Americans are preparing to launch. He is telling them that the phantom on the radar is real. But he is wrong, and he is right. And that contradiction is about to bring the world closer to nuclear midnight than it has ever been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The mystery is not what is happening. The mystery to the Soviet mind is why? Why now? Why this way? They scramble to find the trigger. They look for the provocation. Did a Soviet submarine sink a US carrier? Did a MiG-25 aircraft shoot down an airliner? They search the news wires. Nothing. The world is calm. Civilians are walking their dogs in London and New York. This makes it worse. If there is no provocation, and the Americans are still mobilizing, it means the attack is unprovoked. It means it is a cold-blooded execution. The psychological pressure inside the Kremlin spikes to dangerous levels. The leader of the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov, is a dying man. He is in a hospital bed, hooked up to dialysis machines. His kidneys are failing, and his mind is steeped in the paranoia of a lifetime in the KGB. He is the one receiving these reports. A dying man, leading a dying empire, staring at reports that say the executioner is at the door. The ghost signal keeps growing. Reports flood in from East Germany. Soviet listening posts claim they are hearing a countdown. Not a drill countdown, a real release sequence. Nuclear release authorized, the intercept reads. The analyst in the Moscow bunker feels the blood drain from his face. He looks at his superior. They have authorized release, he whispers. They are going to do it. The superior officer looks at the clock. It is ticking away the seconds of the old world. He has to make a decision. Does he recommend a full alert? Does he tell the strategic rocket forces to open the silo doors? If he does, the American satellites will see the Soviet silos opening. The Americans will think the Soviets are attacking. The Americans will fire in retaliation. It is a loop of madness, a mirror facing a mirror, reflecting fear into infinity. The mystery deepens as the hours pass. The NATO forces are moving with a precision that the Soviets have never seen before. They are not making mistakes. They are not chatting on open channels. They are operating in radio silence, a tactic used only before a strike. The Soviet electronic warfare officers try to jam the signals to test the American reaction. Usually, in a drill, the Americans would complain or pause. This time, the Americans do nothing. They ignore the jamming. They switch to backup frequencies instantly, fluidly, like a machine. It is an automated system, one analyst theorizes. They have handed control to the computers. This theory rips through the command staff. Computers do not hesitate. Computers do not have mercy. The narrative inside the bunker solidifies. The Americans are not just drilling, they are hiding their mobilization in plain sight. The drill is the camouflage. The dagger is underneath. The impossible event has become a terrifying reality in their minds. The NATO alliance, a collection of democracies that usually argue over everything, is moving as a single, silent predator. The question is no longer, is it happening? The question is, how much time do we have left? The commander picks up the phone again. Get me the status of the SS-20 missiles, he barks, and get the pilots of the MiG-23 aircraft to their cockpits, now. The order goes out across the Eastern Bloc. In icy airfields in East Germany, sirens begin to wail. Not drill sirens, war sirens. Pilots rush from their barracks, pulling on flight suits, running toward jets that are already being loaded with live nuclear weapons. In the forests of Czechoslovakia, camouflaged doors slide open. Enormous trucks carrying mobile missiles roar their engines to life, spewing black diesel smoke into the cold air. The Soviet Union is waking up. It is baring its teeth. But the Americans don't know. The Americans are just running a drill. They are drinking coffee. They are practicing new procedures. They have no idea that on the other side of the Iron Curtain, thousands of men are preparing to kill them. This is the true horror of the mystery. It is a one-sided conversation with death. As Part 1 closes, we leave the Soviet command center in a state of controlled hysteria. The evidence is piling up. The American attack seems imminent. The phantom signals are screaming that war is here. The Soviets are investigating a crime that hasn't happened, and in doing so, they are loading the gun that will commit it. The panic that began in the Moscow bunker did not stay underground. Like a virus escaping a lab, it traveled through the nervous system of the Warsaw Pact, moving along secure telephone lines and encrypted teleprinter cables, all the way to the foggy, freezing airfields of East Germany and Poland. The investigation into the phantom American attack had moved from the phase of analysis to the phase of tangible, terrifying action. In the forests of East Germany, the Soviet 16th Air Army received a flash directive that had not been issued since the darkest days of the 1960s. The order was simple, brutal, and devoid of explanation. Prepare for immediate combat operations. For the pilots and ground crews, the mystery was visceral. They did not see the satellite maps or the intercepted codes. They only saw the fear in the eyes of their political officers. At the Altenburg Air Base, the routine of a cold November night was shattered. Technicians were roused from their bunks. They were ordered to the munition bunkers, these special storage facilities that were usually guarded by a triple ring of fences and Spetsnaz troops. The heavy blast doors were cranked open. Inside, resting on cradles like sleeping beasts, were the tactical nuclear weapons. This was the moment the investigation turned into a loaded gun. The ground crews were ordered to load these weapons onto the hardpoints of Su-24 Fencer and MiG-23 aircraft. This was strictly forbidden during normal drills. You never marry a live nuclear warhead to a live aircraft unless you intend to use it. The risk of an accident is too high, but the order stood. As the technicians winched the heavy white shapes under the wings of the waiting jets, they looked at each other. They were investigating the reality of their own demise. Was this a test, a mistake, or were the Americans already flying east? The pilots sat in their cockpits, the canopies sealed against the damp chill. Their headsets crackled with the voices of ground controllers who sounded unusually high-pitched. They were told to wait for the final code. The code that would send them screaming into West German airspace to drop the sun on NATO tank formations. While the pilots waited, the KGB residencies in London, Washington and Bonn were frantically trying to solve the puzzle. The investigation here was of a different nature. It was a desperate hunt for the trigger. Moscow Center was screaming for answers. They bombarded their station chiefs with demands. Find the signs, the cables read. Confirm the mobilization. The tragedy of the Soviet investigation was that it was designed to fail. It was not an objective search for truth, it was a search for confirmation of a nightmare. In London, KGB agents prowled the streets around government buildings. They were looking for the subtle indicators of a government preparing for the end. They counted the cars parked outside the Ministry of Defense. They watched the windows of the Prime Minister's residence. It was a Sunday. The streets were quiet. To a rational mind, this meant peace. But to the paranoid mind of the KGB, trained by the Ryan Doctrine, the quiet was a trick. The streets are too empty, one agent reported. They have cleared the area. They are in the bunkers. They saw a delivery van pull up to a government building. Was it delivering food for a night shift, or was it delivering emergency supplies for a nuclear siege? The agents reported the latter. They were terrified of reporting nothing. In the Soviet system, reporting nothing when the boss believed something was happening was a good way to lose your career or your life. So, they fed the beast. They fed the investigation with shadows and rumors. Every light left on in the Pentagon became proof of the imminent attack. Every movement of a VIP's limousine became part of the evacuation protocol. The legend of the American monster grew with every hour. Inside the Kremlin, the analysts were building a profile of the enemy's plan. They believed they had uncovered a sophisticated, multi-layered deception. They theorized that the Able Archer drill was a mask for a new type of warfare, a decapitation strike. The theory went like this. The Americans knew they could not win a long war. The Soviet tank armies were too numerous. So, the Americans would use their new technology, the Pershing II missiles and the cruise missiles, to snipe the Soviet leadership before the Red Army could even start its engines. The Pershing II was the bogeyman. It was the ghost in the machine. The Soviets calculated that a Pershing II launched from West Germany could hit the Kremlin command bunker in under 10 minutes. It was a weapon with zero warning. The investigation focused obsessively on the Pershing bases. "Are the missile launcher doors open?" Moscow demanded. "We cannot see through the cloud cover," the agents replied. "Assume they are open?" Moscow concluded. This was the fatal flaw in their logic. In the absence of evidence, they assumed the worst-case scenario. They interpreted the silence of the American military not as a lack of activity, but as the disciplined silence of an assassin holding his breath. The confusion was compounded by the new codes. During the Able Archer drill, NATO forces shifted their encryption protocols to a new standard to test their resilience. To the NSA and GCHQ in the West, this was a technical test. To the Soviet signals intelligence officers, this was the blackout. Suddenly, the familiar voices of Western pilots and tank commanders vanished, replaced by bursts of static and digital screeching that the Soviet computers could not break. "They have gone dark," the report to Andropov read. "We have lost our ears." Blind and deaf, the Soviet military machine began to spasm. The investigation turned inward. If they couldn't see the Americans, they had to prepare to fight them blind. In the Baltic Sea, Soviet submarines were ordered to dive and disperse. They were investigating the acoustics of the ocean, listening for the screws of the American hunter-killer subs that they were sure were tracking them. In the skies over the border, Soviet MiG-25 aircraft pushed their engines to the limit, flying aggressively along the demarcation line. They were trying to bait the Americans. They wanted the ghost to show itself. "Turn on your radars!" the Soviet pilots screamed silently at the empty sky. "Lock onto us! Show us you are there!" But the Americans did not take the bait. The NATO jets stayed in their drill lanes. They remained disciplined. They did not engage. To the Soviet mind, this restraint was the most terrifying evidence of all. "They are waiting," the analyst concluded. "They are waiting for the H-hour." By the evening of November 7th, the wrong conclusions had solidified into a concrete reality within the Kremlin. The investigation had proved three things, all of them false. 1. NATO forces had moved to a war footing under the guise of a drill. 2. The civilian leadership of the West had been moved to bunkers. 3. The launch countdown had already begun, masked by the new encryption. The tension in the Warsaw Pact command centers was suffocating. Generals were shouting into phones, demanding updates on the readiness of the SS-20 Sabre missiles. These were mobile launchers, massive trucks carrying ballistic missiles capable of vaporizing European cities. The order was given to move the SS-20 seconds into their firing positions. This was a massive logistical undertaking. Hundreds of heavy vehicles began to move through the frozen forests of the Soviet Union. They were seeking the clearings, the pre-surveyed coordinates from which they could launch their apocalypse. The investigation was over. The verdict was in. The Soviets believed they were staring down the barrel of a gun. They had convinced themselves that the incident was the final countdown. But as the Soviet machine hyperventilated, searching for the enemy was doing something entirely different. While the Soviet pilots sat in their cockpits sweating in their G-suits, staring at the red horizon, the men they were preparing to kill were miles away, in a completely different world. The Americans were not in bunkers. They were not loading nukes. They were creating the very technology that had driven the Soviets insane, but not for the reasons the Kremlin thought. The true source of the ghost wasn't a strategic decision to attack. It was a technological leap so profound that the Soviets couldn't comprehend it without viewing it through the lens of war. The mystery of the invisible signals and the new patterns originated from a place the Soviets had not looked. It was time to leave the panic-stricken bunkers of Moscow and cross the ocean. It was time to see what was really happening behind the curtain of silence. While the Kremlin was burning documents and the pilots of the 16th Air Army were strapping into their nuclear-armed jets, the scene inside the Supreme Headquarters Allied powers, Europe in Mons, Belgium, was strikingly different. There was no panic, there was no smoke. There was only the hum of high-efficiency cooling fans and the soft clacking of keyboards. The men and women here were not fighting a war, they were playing a game. To the American commanders, Able Archer was a triumph of logistics, not a prelude to murder. But the reason the drill felt so incredibly real, the reason it had triggered the ghost signals that terrified Moscow, was rooted in a specific, revolutionary leap in American technology. The source of the Soviet nightmare wasn't a political decision, it was an engineering marvel. For years, the United States had been quietly developing a counterweight to the Soviet military mass. They knew they could not match the Soviets tank for tank. The Soviet industrial machine could churn out T-72 tanks faster than Detroit could make sedans. So, the Pentagon decided to stop playing the numbers game and start playing the precision game. The secret project that hovered over the entire crisis like a grim reaper was the Pershing II. To the American public, it was just another missile. To the engineers at Martin Marietta who built it, it was a masterpiece of aerospace engineering. But to the Soviet High Command, the Pershing II was not a weapon of war. It was a weapon of assassination. This was the phantom the Soviets were really chasing. The Pershing II represented a technological gap that the Soviet Union simply could not cross. Previous missiles were blunt instruments. If you fired a ballistic missile from West Germany at Russia, it might land within a kilometer or two of the target. That was accurate enough for a megaton city killer. But the Pershing II was different. It was designed with a revolutionary guidance system known as RADAG, Radar Area Correlation. Here is the ingenuity that scared the life out of the KGB. When a Pershing II re-entered the atmosphere at 8 times the speed of sound, it didn't just fall blindly, it opened its eyes. A radar in the nose cone would scan the terrain below. An onboard computer, decades ahead of anything the Soviets possessed, would compare the live radar image with a stored digital map of the target area. The missile would then adjust its fins, steering itself while moving at hypersonic speeds. The accuracy was terrifying. It could fly 1,000 miles and land within 30 meters of its target. This meant the Americans didn't need to destroy a whole city to kill the Soviet leadership. They could put a warhead directly on top of the ventilation shaft of the specific bunker where Yuri Andropov was sleeping. This technology was the invisible protagonist of the Able Archer crisis. The drill was designed to practice the release procedures for these exact weapons. When the Soviets saw the new patterns and the silence, they were witnessing the integration of the Pershing II into the NATO command structure. The silence that the Soviet eavesdroppers heard wasn't radio silence, it was digital encryption. The Americans had rolled out new, sophisticated communication systems designed to link the president directly to the nuclear launch commanders in the field. These systems used burst transmissions and frequency-hopping technology that looked like static to the archaic Soviet receivers. In a secure room in the Pentagon, and in the bunkers in Brussels, American officers were testing this new nervous system. They were wearing headsets, holding clipboards, and reading from scripts. Message received, an officer would say calmly, sipping his coffee. Authentication code verified. Release authorized. It was clinical. It was precise. It was professional. They had no idea that their test of the new encryption was being interpreted by the Soviets as the locking of the doors before a massacre. The Americans were focused on the process. They were proud of their ability to coordinate thousands of troops across different countries without a hitch. They were marveling at the speed of their new computers. In 1983, the technological divergence between East and West was becoming a canyon. While the Soviet analyst was relying on a teletype machine that sounded like a typewriter, the American analyst was looking at early digital displays. The US military was beginning its transition into the digital age. The ingenuity here was the seamless integration of intelligence, command, and firepower. The Americans had built a machine that could think faster than the Soviets could react. During the drill, the script called for the Orange Forces, the enemy, to use chemical weapons. The Blue Forces, NATO, were then authorized to respond with limited nuclear strikes. The American officers practiced the transition. They opened the safes. They took out the decoding cards. They read the strings of numbers. Whistler Yankee Foxtrot 9. To the American officer, this was a string of random words. To the Soviet intelligence officer, who had managed to catch a fragment of this transmission, this was the sound of the apocalypse. The source of the panic was the sheer competence of the American military machine. The drill was running too smoothly, the communications were too secure, the timeline was too aggressive. The Pershing II batteries in West Germany were the physical manifestation of this competence. These were mobile launchers. They could shoot and scoot. They could hide in a forest, launch a missile that would hit Moscow in less than 10 minutes, and be gone before the Soviet counterfire arrived. The Soviets knew they had no defense against this. Their anti-ballistic missile systems were designed to hit slow, predictable, intercontinental ballistic missiles. They could not hit a maneuvering hypersonic dart like the Pershing II. The Americans had inadvertently created a first strike capability. They hadn't intended to. The US doctrine was deterrence. The idea was, if we have this missile, you won't attack us. But the view from the other side was different. The Soviets looked at the Pershing II and the new digital command network and thought, you don't build a weapon this accurate just to deter us. You build a weapon this accurate to kill us before we can wake up. This misunderstanding was the engine of the crisis. The American solution to the Cold War stalemate was technology. They believed that superior tech would keep the peace. And in the long run, they were right. But in the short run, in the freezing November of 1983, that superior tech was pushing the enemy into a corner from which there seemed to be no escape. As Part 3 concludes, we see the stark contrast. In the West, calm professionals testing a state-of-the-art digital network, confident in their smart weapons. In the East, terrified men in analog bunkers, convinced that the silence of the West is the silence of the grave. The Americans were playing chess. The Soviets thought they were in a knife fight in the dark. And the moment of truth was approaching. The shock was not going to be an explosion. It was going to be the realization of just how close the razor came to the skin. The drill was scheduled to end on November 11th. But the Soviet machine was just reaching its peak readiness. The train was speeding up just as the track was ending. November 11th, 1983. The clock in the Moscow bunker ticked toward the estimated H hour. According to the frantic logic of the KGB analysts, this was the moment. The NATO exercise Able Archer was scheduled to conclude. In the Soviet mind, this conclusion was the cover for the real launch. The ruffles and flourishes of the drill were expected to transition seamlessly into the roar of rocket engines. Inside the cockpits of the MiG-23 aircraft on the freezing runways of East Germany, pilots watched their instruments. Their fingers hovered inches from the arming switches for their tactical nuclear bombs. They were sweating, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They were waiting for the flash. And then, the teletype machines fell silent. The ghost signals stopped. The encrypted burst transmissions from Brussels ceased. The radar screens, which had been cluttered with the digital phantoms of a mobilizing NATO, cleared up. The American officers in West Germany took off their headsets, laughed about the weekend, and went to the mess hall for lunch. The shock was not a bang. It was a silence so loud it was deafening. The Soviet commanders stared at their screens in total disbelief. They were braced for the impact of a sledgehammer. Instead, the enemy had simply turned off the machine. This was the reveal. This was the moment the fever broke. Slowly, painfully, the realization washed over the men in the Kremlin. There was no first strike. There was no decapitation plan. The impossible event they had spent 10 days tracking the mobilization of the West for total war was a hallucination born of their own paranoia. They had been staring into a mirror and screaming at their own reflection. But the true shock, the moment that chills the blood of historians to this day, came shortly after, from a source deep inside the Soviet machine. It wasn't a satellite photo that revealed the truth. It was a man. His name was Oleg Gordievsky. He was a colonel in the KGB, and he was working for British intelligence. While the Soviet generals were hyperventilating, Gordievsky was watching from the inside. He saw the panic. He saw the orders to load the nuclear weapons. And as soon as he could, he sent a desperate signal to his handlers in London. His message was the reveal that shook the Western world to its core. "You don't understand," the message essentially said. "They weren't drilling. They were getting ready to shoot. They thought you were starting World War III." When this intelligence reached the White House, the reaction was genuine shock. President Reagan, who had spent years talking tough, was reportedly stunned. He had no idea the Soviets were actually afraid. He thought they were playing the same cynical game as everyone else. He didn't realize that the evil empire was terrified, trembling, and holding a loaded gun to its own head. The confrontation was asymmetrical. The Americans were fighting a war of technology. The Soviets were fighting a war of nerves. And this leads us to the futile response. Once the adrenaline faded, the Soviet military tried to analyze what had happened. They looked at their response protocols, the MiG-25 Foxbat interceptors, the massed tank armies, the SS-20 missiles, and they realized a horrifying truth. Even if they had fired, it wouldn't have mattered. The investigation into the Phantom revealed the technological chasm that now separated the two superpowers. The Soviet defense strategy relied on the MiG-25 Foxbat to intercept American bombers. It was a brute of a plane, massive engines, incredible speed. It was designed to fly fast in a straight line and shoot down B-52 seconds. But during Able Archer, the Americans weren't just flying B-52 seconds, they were simulating the use of the Pershing II and the newly developed cruise missiles. The MiG-25 radars were powerful, but they were fueled by vacuum tubes. They were easily blinded by the new American electronic warfare suites. The Soviet interceptors would have been flying blind, hunting targets that were too small to see and too fast to catch. The Pershing II missiles, the source of the panic, would have been falling on their targets at Mach 8. There was no Soviet interceptor, no surface-to-air missile, no laser that could stop them. The Soviet response plan was to flood the zone with tanks. But the American air-land battle doctrine, tested during the drill, showed that NATO could use smart munitions to destroy those tank columns from 50 miles away before they even saw a NATO soldier. The realization was bitter. The Soviets realized they had mobilized their entire machine to fight a war they had already lost in the laboratory years ago. They had built thousands of tanks to fight a war of numbers. The Americans had built microchips to fight a war of precision. The reveal was absolute. The Soviet Union was no longer a peer competitor, it was a dinosaur roaring at a meteor. The agents in London and Bonn quietly packed away their files. The signs they had seen, the lights in the windows, the movement of cars were revealed for what they were, the mundane activities of a free society that wasn't obsessed with its own destruction. The pilots in East Germany were ordered to stand down. The nuclear warheads were winched off the wings of the jets and returned to the bunkers. The heavy blast doors were sealed. The world had survived. But it hadn't survived because of diplomacy. It hadn't survived because of a treaty. It survived because the Americans decided to stop the drill before the Soviets decided to pull the trigger. It was a victory of luck over logic. As the silos closed and the radar screens went back to their rhythmic, peaceful sweeping, the silence that followed was heavy with the weight of what almost happened. The Soviets had looked into the abyss. They thought they saw a monster. But what they really saw was the future, a future where their sheer mass and iron will were no match for the silent, invisible precision of American technology. The sirens in East Germany faded into the damp grey mist. The heavy diesel engines of the mobile missile launchers were cut, and the silence returned to the forests of the Warsaw Pact. But the silence was deceptive. While the physical threat of nuclear war had receded, the psychological shockwave of Able Archer was just beginning to tear through the foundations of the Soviet Union. The crisis of November 1983 did not end when the Americans turned off their radars. It ended years later, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The mystery of the ghost signals had been solved, but the verdict was devastating. The Soviet High Command looked at the data from those 10 terrified days. They looked at how easily the Americans had masked their movements. They looked at the invisible coordination of the NATO forces. And they looked at their own clumsy, blind panic. Here is the killer statistic that haunted the halls of the Kremlin for the next decade. In 1982, just a year before Able Archer, in the skies over Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, Israeli jets using American electronic warfare technology went up against Soviet-made Syrian air defenses. The result was 82-0. 82 Soviet-built MiG aircraft shot down. 0 losses for the Western technology. The Soviets had tried to ignore that number. They called it a fluke. But Able Archer proved it was not a fluke. It was the new reality. The phantom signals the Soviets had chased during the drill were the electronic signature of a military that had evolved beyond them. The Soviet Union was spending nearly 25% of its entire gross domestic product on defense, a quarter of its entire economy poured into steel and iron. The United States was spending less than 7%. And yet, the 7% was winning. Why? Because the Americans were buying microchips, and the Soviets were buying steel. The impact of this realization cannot be overstated. It broke the spirit of the Soviet military leadership. They realized that no matter how many T-72 tanks they built or how many brave pilots they trained, they were fighting a war against information. And in a war against information, the closed, paranoid society of the Soviet Union could not compete. To build the computers needed to track the Pershing II, the Soviets would need a Silicon Valley. But to have a Silicon Valley, you need the free exchange of ideas. You need photocopiers. You need open phone lines. You need the very things that the KGB spent its existence suppressing. The mystery of Able Archer revealed the fatal flaw of communism. The system that protected the regime was the same system that was making it defenseless. The legacy of those 10 days in November is profound. When the intelligence from Colonel Gordievsky finally reached the highest levels of the White House, it changed the course of history. Ronald Reagan, the cowboy, sat in the Oval Office and read the reports of the Soviet panic. He read about the old men in the Kremlin trembling in their bunkers, genuinely believing he was about to kill them. He wrote in his diary, "I was really surprised to learn that the Soviets are so afraid of us." This was the turning point. Reagan realized that the madman strategy, the idea of keeping the enemy guessing, had worked too well. It had pushed the enemy to the brink of a preemptive suicide pact. The terror of Able Archer forced the Americans to change their tone. It paved the way for the summits in Geneva and Reykjavik. It paved the way for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the treaty that eventually banned the very weapons, the Pershing II and the SS-20, that had caused the panic in the first place. The ghost that almost destroyed the world became the catalyst for saving it. But for the Soviet Union, there was no saving the patient. The shock of 1983 accelerated their decline. The desperate attempt to catch up to the American ghost bankrupted the treasury. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, he inherited a military that was terrified of its own shadow and an economy that was bleeding to death trying to buy a flashlight. History is often written in the ink of great battles. We remember Stalingrad. We remember Normandy. We remember the explosions. But the most dangerous moment in human history was silent. It happened in a windowless room in Moscow, where a man held a telephone receiver, listening to static, deciding whether the lack of noise was peace or the holding of breath before the scream. The Able Archer crisis reminds us that the greatest danger in war is not malice, it is misinterpretation. It wasn't the hatred between East and West that almost burned the world, it was the silence between them. We survived November 1983 not because of wisdom, but because of a pause, a hesitation, a moment where a Soviet commander decided to wait for one more second before turning the key. The Cold War ended without a nuclear fire, but the incident remains a spectre. It is a reminder that in the age of hypersonic missiles and AI-controlled defense systems, the line between a drill and a disaster is thinner than a wire. The American dominance of that era was absolute, not because they fired the shot, but because they built a machine so advanced that the enemy defeated themselves just trying to understand it. The ghost signals are gone now. The bunkers are museums. But if you listen closely to the history of that cold November, you can still hear the echo of the world holding its breath.